Chapter 9. Reflection. The original meanings of reflection. The momentary flashes of consciousness we recall when we look back on our childhood have usually grown together in adults into a more or less continuous field of ego consciousness. But still earlier, before these momentary flashes were consciously recognized as inner experience, they existed as preconscious components of human existence and expressed themselves mainly in unconscious action. Jung surmised that the unconscious impulses to ritual actions, in comparison with the teachings and theories formulated in myths or in religious systems, were practiced at an earlier date and were the precursors of the latter. He observed, for example, that the African natives on Mount Elgon spit on their hands at sunrise and held them out to the sun without knowing that this action has a meaning. They had always done this. Seen in the light of today's psychological knowledge of symbols, this gesture means, "O God, I offer up my soul to thee." But, as we have just said, the deed precedes the word by a considerable period of time. The same law prevails in respect to the momentary flashes of consciousness. They too were originally represented in symbolic form and given a ritual application in the shape of glittering small stones or other shiny, mirror-like objects to which were ascribed the power to drive away spirits. The ethnologist Richard Gould reports a good example of this, which he observed among the Australian Aborigines. He and his wife stayed for some time with a friendly family group of 13 Aborigines who, untouched by civilization, lived by hunting and by gathering plants, and who had retained their original age-old outlook and way of living. Even when the heat was extreme, a fire was lighted every evening and kept burning throughout the night to keep away the mamu, the evil spirits. But so far, no mamu appeared. One day Gould decided to go away for a couple of days with the oldest man, who was the spiritual leader of the group. His wife remained with the others. In the evening, after this decision had been made, the children became restless and reported that they had seen 2 mamu skulking around in the twilight. 2 men of the group who were versed in magic took 2 shiny fragments of mother-of-pearl they had found in a mission station, and, pronouncing exorcistic formulas and making a great show of aiming, shot them from their bows in the direction of the 2 mamu. They then assured the others that the mamu had disappeared. It is likely that some of the men who were to remain with the white woman without the authority of the presence of the old man may have had some unorthodox thoughts, especially as these Aborigines are not at all prudish in their views about sex. But evidently they did not experience these temptations as coming from within. Their sudden restlessness was caused by 2 undefinable evil spirits. The glittering, reflecting pieces of mother-of-pearl acted as counter-magic, as atropaic reflection in the literally concrete sense. The magicians asserted that the fragments came back to them at the right time, reflexio. Thus even the phenomenon of momentary flashes of consciousness was originally experienced as projected onto an outer object. Whoever remembers these momentary flashes of consciousness from his own early childhood will know that they are always connected with strongly emotional states. This emotion is at its peak at the moment of the flash, and usually subsides at the same time. It is as if the brief light of consciousness broke up the stifling, obsessive emotion. Objects that reflect can therefore drive away spirits. The reflection calms the affect, or the excited state. That is why when Perseus killed Medusa, the sight of whom turned people into stone, he did not look directly at her, but instead took his aim with the help of a mirror. He could thereby protect himself from being overcome by emotion. Rigidity is caused by an excess of strong emotion, as is shown in the catatonia of schizophrenics. Perhaps it is worthwhile in this connection to take a look at the concept of reflection in physics. All light, as we know, is produced by the motion of electrons, either spontaneously, as when an electron changes its energy level in the atom, or when it is set in motion through the impact of a photon. In the second case, reflection and transmission result. Neither of these events can take place, however, unless the electron has a certain freedom of motion and is not too firmly held in its atom. Normally, when light hits the electrons held at a certain energy level in a single atom, the energy of the light can be absorbed by the energy of the electron. If, however, the atoms are held tightly together in a kind of crystalline lattice structure, it can happen that electrons are able to move about freely inside the lattice and are no longer bound to one atom. In this situation, the electron does not absorb the light energy, but radiates it back. Viewed as a physical phenomenon, therefore, reflection depends on the presence of certain atomic lattice structures. The fact of the matter is that although the larger groupings, the atoms, are mathematically held together more tightly and with more force than usual, certain electrons have precisely for this reason more freedom of motion. Miraculously, as it would seem, the possibility of reflection in the unconscious area of the psyche is connected with an unknown factor that reveals itself on the threshold of consciousness, in dreams and in spontaneous fantasies, as a crystalline mathematical structure, namely, the symbol of the mandala. That psychic center which is represented by the mandala itself, and which, as we know, Jung has called the self, is, when it represents reflected wholeness, very often symbolized by mathematical structures, mostly of quaternary subdivisions, and is often illustrated by the symbol of the crystal. For primordial man, the phenomenon of mirrors and mirroring had the quality of a miracle. For him, the mirrored image was a reality in its own right. Spiegel, the German word for mirror, is cognate with the Latin word speculum, and goes back to Old High German skukar, shadow holder, from skuvo, shadow, and kar, vessel. In Old Indian, a mirror was thought of as a self-seer, or as a seer of doppelgangers. The mirrored image was regarded as shadow, or as doppelganger, that is, as an image of the soul, and the mirror therefore possessed great magical significance. It was an instrument for becoming objectively conscious of one's soul by means of reflection, in the literal sense of the word. Mircea Eliade has collected abundant documentation on the part played by shiny or glittering objects as protection against psychic dissolution by evil spirits. In his book on shamanism, wherein he discusses the initiation rites of shamans and medicine men of innumerable peoples, he describes a ritual in which the novice's entrails are symbolically extracted, cleaned, and replaced by small, shiny stones and glittering chips that give him the magic power over the spirits. Crystals themselves often have the same function of subservient spirits. They mirror events on earth or reveal what is going on in the soul of a sick person. In many places, mirrors are used as a defense against the evil eye of both human beings and of spirits, because it was thought that mirrors throw harmful rays back on their source. In Spain, in Tripoli, and generally in China, mirrors are used for this purpose. A similar purpose is served by fear masks, that is, revoltingly evil-looking distorted faces that show the demon his own image, from which he flees in terror. Reflecting objects have thus had, from time immemorial, a numinous significance for human beings. The oldest experience of a reflecting object may well have been that of the surface of water. In what follows, I am relying principally on the excellent book by Martin Nink, Die Bedeutung des Wassers im Kult und Leben der Alten, Ninck shows that in the world of antiquity, water was always thought of as chthonic, as having sprung from the earth, and that it was always associated with what he calls the night conditions, or night states of the soul: intoxication, dream, trance, unconsciousness, and death. These states were all connected with the mystery of watery depths. Psychologically, water is one of the most frequent symbols of the unconscious, and hence the depths of the water were thought of in many places as the source of all prophecy, and of use in seeing phenomena from the beyond. The great gods with knowledge of the future, Nereus, Proteus, Thetis, and in the Germanic tradition, Mimir, are all water divinities. In the water one can see one's own shadow, one's doppelganger, one's soul image, separate and objective, and also the disembodied outlines of the dead and of gods. The custom of obtaining secret information by staring into a vessel of water, the so-called hydromantia, is therefore practiced throughout the world. In the Middle Ages, in our own cultural tradition, burning candles were placed around a circular vessel filled with water, and the demon was evoked. The spirit answered with images on the water's surface, imagines aquae impressae. In ancient Patras, Greece, a form of magic was practiced that combined both mirror and reflecting water. A mirror attached to a thread was lowered into a well to the water's surface, and its reflection indicated whether a sick person would recover or die. In Lycian Chianae, on the other hand, the same thing was seen directly in the reflecting surface of the water of the well. In European folk magic, the use of an earth mirror was widespread. A box was filled with earth, a glass disc was laid on it, and this disc reflected what was sought. In some places the magic power was imparted to the mirror by leaving the disc for 3 days and 3 nights on the face of the buried corpse of a woman who had died in childbirth. The association of earth and death with the prophetic powers of water and mirror is especially important in this connection. In Virgil, Aeneas receives the final prophecies just as he is about to descend through the lake of Avernus into the kingdom of the dead. Closely related to the water mirror is the dream oracle, which is also often sent by water divinities. The unceasing transformation of the dream images is like a subterranean current, whose gods can likewise change without cease. The symbolization of the unconscious by water, with its mirror-like surface, is of course based in the final analysis on a projection. Nevertheless, the analogies are astonishingly meaningful. Just as we cannot see into the depths of the waters, so the deeper areas of the unconscious are also invisible to us. We can draw only indirect conclusions about them. But on the surface, on the threshold area between consciousness and the unconscious, dream images appear spontaneously, not only seeming to give us information about the depths, but also mirroring our conscious personality, although not in identical form, but rather in a more or less altered form. The mirroring is always by way of the symbolic image that has a place in both worlds. Even though during a dream we feel just as identical with the dream ego as we do with our daytime ego, our dream ego nevertheless has some features that astonish us when we are awake. We may, for example, perform bold deeds in a dream that we would never dare to undertake during the daytime, or our dream ego may exhibit other qualities and attributes we have never seen in ourselves. In contrast to a physically normal mirror image in an undisturbed and undistorted surface, the ego mirrored in dreams is sometimes greatly altered, as is indeed the case with all other dream images. Our dog can talk in dreams. Objects blend into hermaphroditic forms. People who resemble overlapping photographs of 2 acquaintances appear, and so on. But as soon as we begin to interpret the dream according to the rules of the art, an idea of what we are like begins to emerge from the symbolic dream images, and it will astonish us again and again with its relentless objectivity. In his essay, A Psychological View of Conscience, Jung reports the dream of a businessman who on the previous day had been offered what appeared to be a perfectly honorable project, which he was inclined to undertake. During the night he had a dream in which he saw his hands and forearms covered with black dirt. The dream was advising him not to become involved in the matter, and in fact it turned out somewhat later to be dirty business. Fourfold mirroring. The mirroring surface of the unconscious, manifested in dream images, shows us another, often compensatory image of ourselves that seems to have been perceived by another kind of sight or by another person. What strikes us as strange or curious, however, is that the phenomenon of consciousness, which is to us almost completely mysterious, likewise possesses a kind of mirroring quality. One need only recall the above-mentioned theories and explanations of natural scientists on the nature of material phenomena in the external world. In the last analysis, they are nothing but mirrorings, or imaginative, mental, ordered reconstructions of the external world in another medium, namely the human mind. The roots and the basic structure of these imaginative ideas that reconstruct the external world indeed lie in the unconscious, as we saw in Chapter 4, but they are distilled, purified, altered, and given the form in which they are presented at any given moment by the observations, reflections, and formulations of the researcher's ego-consciousness. Even when we attempt, through indirect conclusions, to know not the external world, but the nature of the objective psyche, that is, of the unconscious, we mirror it in our ego-consciousness. And finally, a certain mirror-image relation seems to exist between the unconscious and matter, and this relation is today still filled with riddles. In the case of these mirrorings, there is no longer any question of a disturbance of adaptation to inner or outer realities. This question is contained only by implication, insofar as the suspicion exists that every psychic model image that we make of inner or outer facts, or sets of facts, could turn out, in the course of evolution, to be inadequate and merely subjective, even though at first it serves as an adequate instrument at the attempt to grasp objective reality. For this aspect of projection, therefore, I use the term mirroring, which Jung also often used for the sake of clarity. We must therefore look more closely at 4 mirror relations: the mirroring of the ego by the self, the mirroring of the self by the ego, the mirroring of matter by the collective unconscious, and the possible mirroring of the latter in matter. The mirroring of the ego by the self, the center of the unconscious and of the whole psyche, has already been mentioned. We can discover in every dream how our conscious behavior is objectively mirrored, and how a glimpse of the self is thus mediated from an Archimedean point outside ego consciousness, a glimpse that we could not otherwise have obtained. What we see in the mirror held up to us by the self is hence the only source of genuine self-knowledge. Everything else is only narcissistic rumination of the ego about itself. Not only is the ego of the empirical human being mirrored in the act of self-knowledge, but also the self is then first brought from its state of potentiality into realization by virtue of the fact that it is mirrored in the ego. That is, it is recognized. It is only from the standpoint of the self that the ego can be seen as object, and vice versa, that the ego can obtain in every dream, for example, a clearer notion of the nature and existence of what it is looking at. Therefore, when the ego follows the signals given in dreams, it is helping the self attain realization in time and space. It is then mirroring the self by lifting it out of its unconscious, merely potential existence into the clarity of ego consciousness. So, in a certain sense, we can say that even the self can become aware of itself only with the help of the ego, only in ego consciousness, which is the mirror. In his memoirs, Jung has illustrated this mirror-image relation between ego and self with two of his own dreams. In the first dream, a kind of flying saucer appears in the heavens, flying directly toward him. At the time of the dream, Jung had interpreted UFOs as projections of the self onto unknown external phenomena. But his dream turns the problem around, as he himself says, and suggests that the person, that is, his ego, is a projection coming from the self. The fact that the flying saucer is a machine might indicate symbolically that behind this object is a power that devises and arranges our reality for us, and whose goals and purposes are unknown to us. The second dream is still plainer. It is the previously mentioned dream in which Jung discovers that he is imagined by a yogi. In that dream, the self, as meditating yogi, creates the dreamer's empirical ego. It projects the ego from itself outward, so to speak, and into the three-dimensional world. Here the word projection is understood in the technical sense, as, for example, in the optical projection of an image. Therefore, I prefer to use the word mirroring. This relation between the ego and the self is not only epistemologically, but also in practice, a delicate matter and a heavy responsibility. Paradoxically, the self is the other in one's own inner world, and yet again, it is also only the ego. According to whether a person identifies too closely with the self, or regards it as too far away, as the absolutely other, his dreams will emphasize one or the other aspect. In the Acts of John, cited previously, it was the mysterious otherness of the self that was stressed. In the following dream of a pastor's son who saw God as too outer and as the unknowable other, the opposite was the case. The dream was an anxiety dream that had been recurrent for many years, until the man's late 40s. He dreamed that he was walking through a vast wasteland. He heard steps behind him. Anxiously he walked faster, but the steps too became more rapid. He began to run, the terror still behind him. Then he came to the edge of a deep abyss and had to stand still. He looked down. Deep, deep down, thousands of miles below, he saw hellfire burning. He looked around him and saw, or rather sensed in the dark, a demonic face. Later on, the dream recurred exactly as before, except that instead of a demon, the dreamer saw the face of God. And when he was almost 50 years old, he had the same dream for the last time, but this time panicky fear drove him, and he jumped over the edge of the abyss into the depths below. As he fell, thousands of little square white cards floated downward with him from above. On each card, in black and white, a different mandala had been drawn. The cards floated together into a kind of floor, so that he did not fall into hell, but found a firm landing about halfway down. Then he looked back, upward, to the edge of the abyss. There he saw his own face. The pursuer in the dream is the self, which appears first as the uncanny, then as God, then as the dreamer himself. In the final dream, which evidently brought with it the solution, since it did not recur, the similarity of ego and self, one the mirror image of the other, is underscored. Mirroring of psyche and matter. Synchronicity. A further mirror relation would be the one between psyche and matter. Every physicist today is aware that everything we know about matter in the external world is mental, thus psychic, mirroring. He devises hypothetical images in the form of mathematical structures that he hopes will coincide with the behavior of the material phenomena observed in the experiment. To a large extent, he in fact does the very thing that caused Eugene Wigner to speak of the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. As we saw in Chapter 3, all the great basic themes of the natural sciences are archetypal images whose content has varied and has in the course of history been defined with increasing precision. Our ego can therefore make explanatory statements only indirectly, with the help of the mirror provided by the objective psyche, about the external world and the aspect of matter perceptible by our senses. That is why Jung emphasized that the collective unconscious is a perpetual living mirror of the universe. Our subject is situated between two antithetical worlds, the so-called external world open to the senses, and the unconscious psychic substrate which alone enables us to grasp the world at all. This psychic substrate must necessarily be different from the so-called external world. Otherwise there would be no possibility of grasping it, for like cannot cognize like. Leibniz had already written of the human soul as an active, indivisible mirror, each soul or monad as a perpetual living mirror of the universe. We are left with a big problem, namely, the question of the fourth mirror relation. Whether and how the material world can mirror the objective psyche. If the psychic mirrorings of the material world, in short, the natural sciences, really constitute valid statements about matter, then the reverse mirror relation would also have to be valid. This would mean that material events in the external world would have to be regarded as statements about conditions in the objective psyche. This would indicate that a quite concrete event in the external world could be understood as a symbolic statement about an objective psychic process, which is conscious to an observer. Jung spent a good deal of time on this question. He emphasized that psychology has no Archimedean point outside the psyche, and that there is therefore no possibility of measuring psychic conditions or states objectively. Indeed, atomic physics is in a similar position, inasmuch as the process observed is modified by being observed. The observation is carried out by the physicist's psyche. This strange encounter between atomic physics and psychology has the inestimable advantage of giving us at least a faint idea of a possible Archimedean point for psychology. The microphysical world of the atom exhibits certain features whose affinities with the psychic have impressed themselves even on the physicists. Here, it would seem, is at least a suggestion of how the psychic process could be reconstructed in another medium, in that, namely, of the microphysics of matter. Certainly no one at present could give the remotest indication of what a reconstruction would look like. Obviously, it can only be undertaken by nature herself, or rather, we may suppose it to be happening continuously, all the time the psyche perceives the physical world. The psyche creates consciousness, or better, the self-cognition of the universe. Elsewhere, Jung writes that in telepathy, an outer event occurs simultaneously inside the psyche, and reaches consciousness by the usual pathways of inner perception. However, it is not always possible to determine whether a primary inner process is accompanied by an outer one, or whether, conversely, a primary outer event is being reflected in a secondary inner process. Jung is here alluding to the problem of synchronistic phenomena, events in the external world that have the same meaning as endopsychic events. Before going into the problem of synchronicity in some detail, I would like to illustrate the practical side of this hypothetical mirroring of the psyche by matter. It is alien to our modern rational thinking and ideas, and occurrences that may serve as supporting evidence are generally dismissed as nonsense. That was not the case in primitive magical thinking, which played an important role in our own tradition down into the 17th century. In ancient China, the principle of synchronicity was the dominant way of understanding events in the environment and in history. As Li Guanyin has explained, it was believed that the behavior and the fate of man, the microcosm, had a clear connection with the macrocosm. It was the emperor who was first of all responsible for harmony in nature and in society. If he or his government deviated from the Tao, heaven expressed its anger in the form of unusual phenomena. These were appropriately interpreted, and the ruler then had to atone for his past behavior and change his ways. Sometimes, though, the interpretation of an event was disputed. On one occasion, after an earthquake, a mountain surrounded by a lake rose up out of the earth. The emperor's wife, Wu Zetian, took this to be a good augury, and named the new creation Happy Mountain. Whereupon a citizen sent the following petition to the palace. I, your subject, have learned that cold and heat fall into disorder when the breathing of heaven loses its harmony, that an ulcer is formed when the breathing of men becomes distorted, and that heights and hills are raised up when the breathing of earth is confused. Now, your majesty, a woman is taking the place of the original principle yang, that is, the throne. This means exchanging the strong for the weak. Your majesty must cultivate repentance and fear in obedience to the warning from heaven. Otherwise, I fear calamity will follow. The empress did not react with repentance, but banned her outspoken subject from the court. Translated into modern psychological language, the subject interprets the emergence of the mountain, Chen, mountain, is a masculine principle in Chinese, as a reflection of the fact that the empress was far too masculine in attitude and action, animus possessed in Jungian language. The masculine mountain, which towers over the feminine earth symbol, Kun, and the equally feminine image of the lake, Tui, indicated this to him. All older Chinese thinking was oriented in this way to the principle of synchronicity. Whenever psychic and material occurrences with the same meaning coincided, they made visible what was happening in Tao, the meaning of the universe. Events in nature mirrored the psychological state of things at the emperor's court and provided information about psychic processes of which the rulers were not sufficiently conscious. Jung's view, expressed more or less incidentally, that matter might possibly mirror psychic processes as continuously as the psyche perceives the physical world, but that for the present it lies beyond the scope of our understanding, was further clarified in one of his later works and in his later letters. The postulate was that a psychic process could be reconstructed as being at the same time a physical process. One could also say that under certain conditions, the physical process reflects itself in the psychic, just as the psychic does in the physical. This idea led Jung in one of his later works, Synchronicity, an Acausal Connecting Principle, to the formation of a new hypothesis, namely, the existence of an absolute knowledge in the unconscious. This knowledge is directly connected with the archetypal structure of the unconscious. The archetypes appear to be connected with a knowledge of themselves that is independent of both external causal and conscious influences, and at the same time stand in analogous or equivalent, that is, meaningful, relationship to objective external occurrences that have no recognizable or even conceivable causal relationship with them. What Jung describes as the absolute knowledge of the collective unconscious manifests itself, among other ways, in the extraordinary orientation to space and time of unicellular organisms, which is at least partly rooted in an inner activity that functions independently of objective stimuli. Absolute knowledge exists in a space-time continuum in which space is no longer space, nor time, time. Inner and outer events that are parallel can be perceived only if they have some relation to the ego consciousness of an observer. So far, we have been looking at the archetypes as psychic structures or psychic probabilities, but they have another aspect. They seem to be a structure that also underlies psychophysical equivalences. The deepest and most clearly distinguishable archetypal factor, which forms the basis of psychophysical equivalences, is the archetypal patterns of natural numbers. All a priori factors, as well as radioactive decay in the field of physics, fall within this category. In respect to mathematical structure, the acausal orderedness in matter is of the same kind as that in the psyche, and each is continually reflected in the other. On the other hand, events like the appearance of the volcano in analogy with the psychic condition of the Empress belong to those special cases, occurring only sporadically, in which an observer, in our case the intelligent subject, is in a position to recognize the meaning of the equivalence of the two events. But the Empress, possessed by her power demon, misinterpreted the event, a problem to which we must return. At first sight, mirrorings of psyche and matter that have the same meaning can be empirically established only in the relatively rare and irregularly occurring synchronistic events. It seems likely to me, however, that Jung's observation that the reconstruction of psychic processes in the microphysical world probably occurs as continuously as the psyche perceives the external world is to be understood in the sense that this mirror relation exists continuously in the deeper layers of the unconscious, but that we become aware of it only in certain exceptional situations in which synchronistic phenomena become observable. That would mean that in the deepest layer of the unconscious, the psyche knows itself in the mirror of the cosmic world, and that matter knows itself in the mirror of the objective psyche. But this knowledge is absolute in the sense that, for our ego, it is almost completely consciousness transcending. Only in those rare moments when we are impressed by synchronistic phenomena do we become conscious of fragments or points of this mirror relation. The fourth mirror relation, that of psyche and matter, is based on the same element as the reflection of light in physics, namely, an arithmetical order. Number, as Jung wrote, is the predestined instrument for creating order, or for apprehending an already existing, but still unknown, regular arrangement, or orderedness. It may well be the most primitive element of order in the human mind. That is, the most primitive manifestation of the spontaneous dynamics of the unconscious psyche. In the deepest levels of the objective psyche, there is probably an acausal orderedness with a numerical structure that is equally valid for both the psyche and for matter. There in the lattice patterns of the numerical field, psyche and matter, we may conjecture, are continuously mirroring each other, whereas in synchronistic events, we become aware of this mirror relation only exceptionally, and then as specific happenings pregnant with meaning. Synchronistic events are therefore characterized by the intrusion into our normal state of consciousness of a second psychic state, which usually remains below the threshold. In our normal state of consciousness, we are seldom aware of the fact that the conscious psyche makes a substantial contribution to our perception of reality, and that we never perceive reality as such. Moreover, we can apparently put our trust in our ideas of reality. If I reach for a box of matches, my hands reach out to the place where the box is. The match lights, as expected, when the match is struck, and so on. Hence we are scarcely ever aware that even in this normal state of relation to the outer world, we are moving in a field of images that deviates considerably from the reality that has been demonstrated by physics, that space-time and causality are modalities of apprehending our environment and are dependent upon the structure of our consciousness, and perhaps do not even exist objectively, is hardly ever conscious to us. These modalities build in us a kind of common-sense reality that makes it possible for us to communicate with one another fairly satisfactorily. When synchronistic phenomena occur, this normal psychic condition is interrupted by another state of mind, during which one or more external events occur that are experienced as having a parallel meaning to the subjective state. Using our example of the patient with a fear of outdoor stairways, this would mean that the patient perceives and knows or fears the danger of outdoor stairs as an inner image, although the event corresponding to the inner image has not yet occurred. A causal connection is not thinkable because an event that has not yet taken place cannot produce effects. Nevertheless, one can hardly deny a meaningful connection between the anxiety-filled images and the external event. We have to understand simultaneity in a very broad sense in this example, since there is a distance in time between the beginning of the phobia and the corresponding event. For this reason, Jung called such phenomena synchronistic and not synchronous, because the coincidence is not one in clock time. As long as the accident on the stairway had not yet taken place, the patient's phobia appeared to be a meaningless lack of adaptation, and seemed to be a projection. The undeniable fact of his death on an open stairway, however, showed that the phobia was an example of telepathy, or, alternatively, a synchronistic event. The reverse of this case can, however, also appear in practice, that an event which should really be described as a synchronistic phenomenon is falsely interpreted, and thus becomes a projection. A man who was on the point of slipping into a psychotic interval, more precisely into an attack of messianic mania, did in fact attack his wife, who called in a doctor and the police. As they entered the house intending to remove the unfortunate man against his will to a clinic, the lamp in the corridor shattered with a bang, so that suddenly they were all standing in darkness in the midst of the broken glass. The patient saw clearly that what had happened was a supernatural sign. Just as the sun grew dark when Christ was crucified, this event was to him a confirmation that he was a savior who was being unjustly arrested. We, on the other hand, would say that he had projected his delusion into the event. Thus the synchronistic phenomenon, in itself meaningful, was instead covered up by a projection. To a person with normal consciousness, the meaning of the occurrence would be quite different. A lamp, in contrast to the sun, is not a cosmic principle, but an appliance invented by man. It usually symbolizes ego consciousness in dreams and fantasies. The meaning of the unusual event would then more probably be expressed thus. In the moment of intense agitation caused by his imminent arrest, the patient's ego consciousness was shattered, and a mental blackout resulted. The patient, however, could not grasp this meaning. When a synchronistic event takes place, and no observer perceives its meaning, Jung speaks of synchronous, rather than synchronistic, events. In our case, that would be the shattering of the light of ego consciousness in the patient and of the lamp in the corridor. Nobody saw the meaning at the time. When the man's wife reported the occurrence to me, I recognized it. I mention this because it is an example of a type of situation I have often observed in my psychological practice. At the time of dropping into a psychotic interval, most patients are in a highly excited, emotional state, and an archetype in the unconscious, or, indeed, the whole collective unconscious, is violently activated. Hence, synchronistic events occur with conspicuous frequency at such times, although they also occur with normal people when an archetype is activated. And at such times the patient will make a false interpretation of synchronistic phenomena in a way designed to confirm his morbid fantasies, rather than to correct them. One of the old church fathers would have said in such a case that a demon or demons had worked a false miracle with the intention of misleading people with lying phantasmagoria. We have seen that the early Christian fathers were much preoccupied with the problem of why demons, too, can work miracles and apparently speak the truth. Indeed, in the exorcisms of the 16th and 17th centuries, what the devil spoke through the mouth of the one possessed was carefully written down, because it was thought that the demon often speaks the truth. Tragically enough, people were sometimes executed who had been accused of witchcraft by a devil speaking through a person in the state of possession. If we want to grasp the differences between projection and synchronistic events more precisely, we shall have to look more closely at a point as yet mentioned only peripherally, namely, the flow of psychic energy. Jung pointed out that the aforementioned disturbance of adaptation that justifies our labeling subjective images as projections occurs only when the psychic energy begins to regress, the energy that before had flown toward the object and activated the psychic idea of it we had made for ourselves. The energy flows back to the subject, either because it is repelled by the object, unrequited love, or an enemy unobligingly offering no opportunity for a quarrel, or because it simply flows back spontaneously, without any cause that we can discover. The inner self-regulation of the psyche sometimes causes this in order to charge another object, or to raise the inner potential. In synchronistic events, the situation is different. In this case, an archetype in the unconscious is explosively constellated, which is often the case, as Jung emphasizes, when consciousness sees no way out of some life situation, or when it sees no solution to a problem. In projection, therefore, the undisturbed flow of energy inward from ego to self, that is, reflexio, reflection, is blocked. Whereas in the synchronistic event, the flow of energy from the self to the ego and daytime consciousness is thwarted. That is, a realization is blocked. In the case of projection, the psychic energy recedes to the subject's unconscious. In synchronistic phenomena, it flows from the unconscious toward the ego in order to guide it toward a creative discovery. That is why Jung also called synchronistic events acts of creation in time. They indicate that the experiencing subject should realize something that has been constellated in the unconscious, whether this be a new idea or a healing insight. In Zen Buddhist meditation, the master tries to teach his pupil how he can forever keep the inner mirror free of dust. To the extent that he lives in complete accord with the rhythm of psychic energy and with its regulator, the self, he has no projections anymore. He looks at reality without illusion, and more or less continuously reads the meaning of all the synchronistic events happening around him. He lives in the creative current or stream of the self, and has himself indeed become a part of this stream. If he remains, so to speak, always in contact with the succeeding currents of psychic energy that are regulated by the self, he no longer experiences disturbances of adaptation, no longer projects, in the stricter sense of the word, but remains at the center of the fourfold mirror relation. Obviously, only a person with the most highly reflected concentration can achieve this. We average human beings, by contrast, will hardly be able to avoid the necessity, for the rest of our lives, of again and again recognizing projections for what they are, or at least as mistaken judgments. It seems to me, therefore, to be extremely important to bear constantly in mind, at the very least, the possibility of projection. This would lead to much greater modesty on the part of our ego consciousness. and to a readiness to test our views and feelings thoughtfully, and not to waste our psychic energy in pursuing illusionary goals.